What if Jesus' life was not an accident? What if human history, with its ups and its downs and its bright spots and its dark spots, was in the middle of a story in a mission that God was working on throughout history? What if God was orchestrating a plan throughout human history to bring us to a certain point? That Jesus did not just show up and go, hey, I'm going to let this happen, let the chips fall where they may, or I'm going to let these things happen how they will. And rather that God had a purpose, and that Jesus had a purpose in the way that he moved and interacted in the world that we live in. That's going to be a very important question for us today, because we're going to be teaching on what we call the Lord's Supper or communion or the Eucharist. I don't know what you grew up calling it, but we're going to be going through the passage where Jesus is having his last supper with his disciples, and he institutes the thing we call communion. He breaks the bread and he shares the wine, and he says, this is my body, and all that sort of stuff. And what's fascinating about the death of Jesus Christ is that it happens at Passover. So I want you to be thinking about, as we read through this, I'm going to read through the whole passage, I want you to be thinking about all the things that are going on in Jesus' life where he still pauses and says, hey guys, this is a really important thing. It's going to be a big deal in the church. And I want you to never I want you to never stop doing this, because I want you to focus on this to remember me forever by. Think about all the things that are going on in his life, that he has the mental fortitude and the wisdom to stop and go, this is what I'm going to focus on right now, right here. Matthew chapter 26, starting in verse 17. Says, on the first day of the festival of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and they asked him, where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover? And he replied, go into the city to a certain man and tell him, the teacher says, my appointed time is near. I am going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house. Wouldn't you like to have that job from Jesus? Okay, I'm going to go into town to a certain man. All right. So the disciples did as Jesus directed them, and they prepared the Passover. And when evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12, and they were eating. And he said, truly I tell you, one of you will betray me. And they were very sad and began to say to him, one after the other, surely not me, Lord. If you don't mean me, Lord, not me. You're not talking about me, are you? And Jesus replied, the one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born. Then Judas, the one who is going to betray him, said, surely you don't mean me, Rabbi. And Jesus answered, you have said so. Now think about all the stuff going on. It's Passover, it's a whole week thing. They're in Jerusalem, it's not their hometown, all the stuff going on. He knows one of his friends is going to betray him. This whole conversation just happened. The anxiety in the room, what's happening? And while they were eating, Jesus took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, take and eat, this is my body. And he took a cup. And when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. This is the blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. And I tell you, I will not drink from this cup, the fruit of the vine, from now until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And as you probably know, the Mount of Olives is where Jesus prays and he sweats blood and he asks God, can I get out of this? I don't want to die. And this is what's going on. And Jesus takes this giant break. He pokes right through the whole tension of the scene, everything that's going on in his life, all the weight of the world's on his shoulders. And he goes, guys, I want you to take this into the future. I want you to take the bread and the cup and remember me always with it. Here's what we're going to be asking to answer the question, what if Jesus' life was not an accident? Here's how we're going to break down our time. We're going to look at the history of Easter and the meal of Easter and the worship of Easter. You ready? So the history of Easter. What is going on? Because it's one of the fascinating things that Jesus, his death happened to land at the Passover. It happened to land at the festival of the unleavened bread. It says it was the first day of the festival of the unleavened bread. And the disciples came to him and said, "Where do you want to have the Passover? We're not from here. We don't know we're not from this town. We don't have a house here, but I'm assuming you're not going to skip the Passover. None of us are planning on skipping the Passover. Where are we going to do it?" And so the question is, what is the history that's leading to this moment where Jesus dies? What is it? Well, the Passover is a moment, it is a holiday. It's the biggest holiday, the biggest festival in the nation of Israel, okay? It's called the Passover, but it's like our celebration, Independence Day. We have a day in the year, every single year, we celebrate Independence Day, but it points back to an actual day that was the Independence Day, right? In the Passover, it points back to a day where there actually was the Passover. And so what was that? God's people, Israel, were captive in Egypt. They are slaves for many, many years. And God sends Moses in there and says, "I want you to set my people free." And Pharaoh says, "No." And so God and Pharaoh duke it out for a while. We call this the 10 plagues, where God sent different plagues into the land of Egypt, where he systematically went through and made a mockery of all the gods, of all the top gods of Egypt. He mocked the frog god by sending a swarm of frogs to go hopping all over the town, and they couldn't take it. They were in the food, and they were in the water, and they were everywhere. And he mocked the Nile because that was their life source, and he turned it to blood. And he mocked the sun god, Ra, because he made it just day and night. It was pitch black dark. And the person who God made the biggest mockery of was Pharaoh, who considered himself to be a god. No one's going to tell me what to do. No one's going to push me around. You ever feel like a Pharaoh sometimes? I should just be God right now, right? And God's going, no, 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 no. I'm the one true living God. And then he comes to Moses and he says, "I'm sending my last plague. The firstborn male of every household is going to die. A destroyer is coming into town. He's coming into the city. And I need you." And I'm not going to protect Israel just because they're Israel like every other plague. It's weird. Every other plague, Israel, when it was pitch black, Israel had night and day like normal. But this time, he's not protecting Israel just because they're Israel. He says, what I need you to do in order to avoid the destroyer is I need you to take a good, perfect lamb without any blemishes, without any defects. I need you to slaughter him, and I need you to paint his blood on the doorposts of your house. And when the destroyer comes, anyone who rests under the blood of the lamb will be saved. And everyone who doesn't will have the firstborn son stricken down. And so, this was the foundational, and so during that, and with the lamb then became the centerpiece of the meal they called the Passover, and it's like those football games, there's a sporting event where it's the catch, the catch, right? Or it's something like that, but it's not just a noun, it's actually a time where a guy actually caught the ball, right? And what he's saying is, the Passover is the same way. We use it as a noun, but it's actually a verb the first time. He said, those who have the blood painted on the doorpost, the destroyer will pass over them. And he's going, I'm going to break you out of here so fast. I want you to have your meal. I want you to have your shoes on and your belts fastened and your rod in hand. I don't want you to even put leaven in the bread because you won't have time for the bread to rise. It's going to be so fast that I get you out of here that you just have to eat and be ready to go. And this breaking people out of Egypt was a founding moment in the nation of Israel. To where when God takes them into the wilderness and he gives them the 10 Commandments and the rest of the law, he does it on the basis, not that he created the world, though that's a good thing, and God did create the world, and that's good enough for us to worship him, but he did more than that. He didn't just make these people, he saved these people. And so when he's about to give the law, this is what he says. Exodus 20 says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And then he gives the 10 Commandments, which is the foundation of the law. And so this is the history of the moment that Jesus is having with his disciples as the Passover. And you're going, what is happening here? What is the Bible trying to tell us having Jesus die on the Passover? Was it an accident? Did it just happen to happen that way? No. Jesus is saying, guys, I want you to hear something. There's another destroyer out there. And he's not just coming for the firstborns, he's coming for all of us. He's coming to every household, to every city, to every nation. And no one can escape this destroyer unless they rest under the blood of the Lamb. You know, when Jesus was early in his ministry, he had a guy who went before him to tell people that Jesus was coming. His name was John the Baptist. And one time Jesus shows up on the scene and John the Baptist sees him and he goes, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." He is the one that's going to stand between us and the destroyer. And what's the destroyer? It is sin and death. It is our sinfulness. It is our sinfulness that's destroying us. The Bible says that the wages of sin is death, and no one escapes it unless they rest under the blood of the Lamb. So the history that's leading up to this moment with Jesus is this entire history of these people. And Jesus is about to hijack it. He's about to go, we're not just pointing back to there anymore. We're starting something brand new right here. And he does it right in the middle of the meal. So that's the history of Easter. Now here's the meal of Easter. Jesus is with his disciples. They're in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is like whatever size city it is, I don't know. But then when Passover comes, it just swells to be this massive city. Like Israelites from all over the world come into Jerusalem, so they're just piled on top of each other. People happen to be passing through because there's a big trade route there. Roman armies and governors and politicians show up to make sure no warfare is going to happen. There's not going to be a big mob or looting or anything like that happening. So there's just people everywhere. And Jesus is with his 12 disciples, and he goes, "What are we going to do? We're not going to skip the Passover, are we?" And Jesus gives them one of those wonderful jobs that Jesus gives his disciples. He goes, "No, I want you to go talk to a certain man." And they're like, "Okay." It's like, "Can you just please talk to a certain man, please? We just go find a certain man." And they do, and they set up the Passover. And the way the Passover was set up, these meals back then, was they'd have a short table, and you'd all have you'd be able to lounge on the ground, right? And then you'd have elbow cushions, and you'd kind of sit around the table like this. And the person on your right was the guest of honor, and the person on your left was the second highest guest of honor. And then they kind of go around the table this way. And then this area here was the fourth wall, because a lot of painters were going to come in that night and make paintings of the last. It's a joke, guys. Come on. It's not in the Bible, all right? Okay. I was just seeing if you were awake. You're really taking that part a little too seriously. And so that's how they would just kind of lounge around. And they would take bread and they would dip it in the whatever and eat whatever. And they think that Judas was on his left or his right. He's one of the highest guests of honor that night. Jesus is going, "Hey, I want you to be on my right hand or my left hand." And he's sitting there with a pocket full of silver because he's already betrayed Jesus. And Jesus goes, "Yeah, someone who's dipping bread in oil with me, someone who's just sharing a meal with me, is going to betray me." And all this is going on, and then he gets to this, and he says, "While they were eating, Jesus took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples, saying, 'Take and eat, this is my body.' And then he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, 'Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. And I tell you, I will not drink of this fruit of this vine until I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom.'" Now, the Passover meal was designed to be a memory aid. It was designed with kids involved and in mind and all these sorts of things. So kids had questions that they get to ask their dad, and they would say, what about this and that and the other? And it would allow the head of the household to remind them the history of the Passover. And so it's like this call and response type thing. And what happens when it says things like Jesus had given a blessing, or they had sung a hymn, or all these sorts of things, that's probably Jesus leading his disciples through the Passover. He's being the head of the household there, and he's leading them through the Passover like they always did with their dad and all that sort of stuff. But then he gets to the bread. And there's a point with the bread where the head of the house would break it and he would give this blessing. He would say this. He would give thanks. He said, "Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." And then he'd break it and he would say, "This is the bread of affliction that our fathers ate." But this time Jesus does the blessing. He says, "This is my body broken for you." Hold on. What is Jesus saying right there? You can't just change it all up like that right there. Who do you think you are? The answer is he thinks he's the Savior of the world. And he's going, the Passover, even way back then, the Passover was not just a moment where we remember where God saved Israel, but it was a moment that pointed forward to the day right here, right now, where I would be here and I would do something utterly, completely new that no one's ever seen before. And I would die for the world. And this is no longer just pointing back to the future, but it's the start of something brand new. Something that's not just for Israel, but for everyone on earth. And it's going to be made real when I die. When I die. And then he keeps going. There's one little bump in the road, but Jesus gets weird sometimes. But then he gets back in the Passover, and it's like we get going again. And they start handing out the cups of wine. And there's 4 cups of wine that they would go through in the Passover. The first one, and they all aligned with a promise that God made Israel. And the first one was that he would promise that he would bring Israel out of Egypt. The second one, that I will free you from being slaves. 3, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm with mighty works. And 4, I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. And they think it was on the 3rd cup where he says, I will redeem you with mighty works, with an outstretched arm, that Jesus took the cup and he blessed it and he said, "Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe." And when they would normally say, "Who gives us the fruit of the vine?" he says, "This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." No longer is it just a memory aid. It is a message of God's grace for the future. Now this cup does 3 things according to this verse. 1, it is the blood of the covenant, which every covenant had to have blood, and Jesus' blood was going to be blood of the covenant. And it's the new covenant coming from God through the death of Jesus Christ, which was required to make it happen. And the second thing it says is it's poured out for many. Anyone who will accept it can have it. It is no longer just for one nation. Up until this point, every religion on the face of the earth was very specifically to a nation. And he now goes, no, I'm opening it up to everyone. Anyone who will accept it can have it. It's poured out for many. And then the third thing that he tells us is that it's for the forgiveness of sins. For the destroyer that's coming to our lives. And this is something I got from a preacher named Tim Keller, and I use it all the time because it's really helpful to me. He says, the gospel tells us that we are far more sinful and broken than we would ever dare admit. But it also tells us that we are far more loved and accepted than we would ever dare ask for. Like our sin is so bad that Jesus, God himself, had to die for it. He couldn't just say, "Okay, I forgive you." No, it's so bad that he had to die for it. But he loves us to the point where he would die for it. This is the grace of God. This is the gospel that changes our lives. The love of Jesus. And why would he do that? Because he wants us to be his people, and he wants to be our God. And he would do anything necessary to make that happen. And this is what Jesus has in his mind. His friends are about to betray him or reject him or bail on him. He's about to go to the cross. The politicians are about to fail him. The soldiers are about to beat him. The crowds are about to cheer for his death. The religious leaders are about to work for him to die. Everything's weighing down on him, and he's looking at this moment going, guys, I just want to let you know what you have in me. I want you to know what I'm giving you right now. And he's keeping his mind focused on what his task is. And the question that I have to ask is, how does he do that? How is it possible for Jesus to have been so mentally steadfast so that he could stay on topic when all the world was crashing down on him? And it's an important question because he's not the only one in the history of the world that had that had a hard time. He might have had the hardest time, but you have hard times too. You go through dark moments too. You go through nights where you go, I don't know what's coming next too. Over the last year, my prayer list, the people I've been praying for, because of completely unforeseeable circumstances, sickness and financial things and work things, the number just multiplies. And you look around and you go, where is all this brokenness coming from? How are we going to get through this? And there's an amazing thing at the very end of this story that I think helped center Jesus and could help center you and me too. The story ends talking about the worship of Easter. He says in verse 30, when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives, which is to say, he went out to his death, because that's where he's going to get captured, and that's where he's going to be taken to get beaten, right there. So what was this hymn? What song did Jesus lead his people through? Well, they say that the hymn that they would sing at the end of the Passover meal was called the Egyptian Hallel, Psalms 115 through Psalm 118. And they would sing it together. And in this Hallel, this great worship, this hallelujah section of the Bible, you get this refrain that says this: give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and his love endures forever. This is the words that Jesus was singing to his death. These are the words that he sang with the presence of his betrayer in front of him. These were the words he was singing as he said, God, I don't want to do this, but I know your love endures forever. Now that word there, love, is the Hebrew word hesed, H-E-S-E-D, hesed. And as far as I can figure out, it is the closest concept in the Old Testament that we have to the New Testament concept of grace. Hesed is translated many different ways. It's his loving kindness. It is his mercy. It is his everlasting love. Like this, it's a very long and enduring love that God has for his people. It is because of God's hesed that he never bails on Israel. It is because of his hesed that Israel can hope in the future. It is because of his hesed that no matter where Israel goes, God will always bring them back into his fold because he loves them. His love endures forever. And here's what Hebrews says, that when Jesus is going to his death, he says this: it was the joy set before him that he endured the cross, scorning its shame. How could he do that? How could he walk to his death that way? How could he love us so much like that? Why could he endure the cross? Because he knows that the love of his Father endures forever. The pain of the cross was going to last for a little while, but the love of God was going to last forever. And so, he's going to go see the crowds who will chant for his death. But God's love endures forever. He will see the religious leaders completely fail and be self-serving instead of serving the people. But he knows that God's love endures forever. He will see his friends betray him, swear to the heavens they never met him, and leave him alone in the dark. But he knows that God's love endures forever. I don't know. I don't know what you're going through. I'm new here. But I do know that this life brings hard times. It brings good times. We should always be grateful for those too. Let's never forget that. But it does bring hard times. It brings moments of uncertainty. Situations where you don't know how you're going to get out of it. Things where you don't know how, impasses you don't know how you're going to get through. And you sometimes will just throw your hands up and go, what on earth do I do here? Well, one thing is that we can trust that God's love will endure us through that. Because his love endures forever. But here's what's cool about Christianity. A lot of things for the people in the Bible that they had to live on and base their lives on were promises. And God makes good on his promises. I'm not here to say he doesn't make good on his promises. He does. His promises are good, and we can trust them, and I do trust them. But some things in the Bible we have are better than promises because God has already made good on them. See, what we have in Jesus Christ is a lot like the Passover. The Passover was not a promise. A Passover was an event in the past where God had already freed Israel from slavery. He had already saved them from the destroyer. And what we have in the cross, what we have in the gospel, is not just a promise, but we have something Jesus has already done. We know God's love can endure forever because Jesus, through his love, has already endured the cross. What else is there? What else is there for him to endure that's greater than that? Whatever we're going through, we can trust him because his love endures forever. Worship is an important thing for Christians because it reminds us who our God is. And let us be a church who lives our lives saying, give thanks to the Lord, our God and King. His love endures forever.